It was just another morning. The sun had barely started to filter through the curtains, casting long shadows across the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug familiar in my hands, and I breathed in the rich, earthy aroma. It was a moment of stillness, a brief pause in a life that often felt too busy, too loud, too much. And then there it was. The knock. Sharp, insistent, the kind that didn't wait, the kind that demanded attention. Not the polite tap-tap-tap of a neighbor wanting to borrow sugar. No, this was different. This knock felt like it was dragging the world into my little bubble, shattering the fragile calm I had carved out for myself. I set the mug down with a slight clink, the sound suddenly too loud in the quiet of the room. My hands, still warm from the cup, moved instinctively to my robe, wiping them dry. I wasn't expecting anyone. Not today. Certainly not after the week I had just survived. With a slow exhale, I made my way to the door. Each step seemed to stretch longer than the last, my heart already picking up pace, an unsettling mix of anticipation and dread growing in my chest. As I reached for the doorknob, I couldn't help but wonder who would be on the other side. Maybe it was a salesman. Maybe it was the neighbor from down the street. But the question felt small, insignificant, because in that moment, as my hand closed around the cool metal, I knew, somehow, that whatever waited on the other side was not going to be something I could easily brush off. And when I opened the door, the last thing I expected was to see her. Anna, Mark's new girlfriend, the woman who had taken my place. She stood there, her smile wide and bright, an unsettling mix of smug satisfaction and entitlement that seemed to radiate off her. There was no hesitation in her expression, no uncertainty, just the kind of confidence that comes with knowing exactly what you want and exactly how to take it. And in that moment, I realized something. It was all over. This was it. My life, my marriage, my everything. It had all been laid bare, and she was standing there, like a conqueror staking her claim. She didn't wait for me to say anything. Instead, she simply looked me up and down, her eyes lingering with a touch of something almost too satisfied. Then, she spoke, her voice a melody of triumph. "Sarah," she said, her words dripping with a sweetness that only made them feel more venomous. "You need to start packing. We're moving in." And just like that, the world I had known, the world I had worked so hard to keep together, began to fracture. But something inside me didn't respond with panic or anger. Instead, there was a calm, a cold, calculated calm that filled my chest, turning the panic into something else, something far more dangerous. I smiled, not because I was happy, not because I had won, but because in that moment, I realized that while she might have thought she had control, she was walking into a situation where she was far from the one holding the power. Behind her, just out of sight, stood someone who knew far more than Anna did, my lawyer. And that was when I knew. I wasn't alone in this. This was just the beginning. She stepped into the house like she already belonged here, her high heels clicking against the polished wooden floor. The sound was sharp, almost mocking, as if announcing her arrival. Anna barely glanced around, her gaze fixed firmly on me. There was a smile on her lips, but it wasn't one of warmth. It was a smile that told me she had won, that she had taken everything from me, and now she was here to claim the rest. I stood frozen for a moment, just watching her move through the space that had once felt so much like mine. Every step she took seemed deliberate, calculated, like she was marking her territory. She didn't even acknowledge the fact that this house had been a part of my life long before she ever appeared in it. She was here for one thing and one thing only, to take what she believed was rightfully hers. But something in me had shifted. The shock had worn off, and in its place was clarity. She didn't know what was really going on. She didn't know who she was dealing with. I took a slow breath, holding back the urge to let the anger rise. No, today was not the day for that. Today was the day I would show her that she had walked into the wrong house. I glanced behind her, where my lawyer was standing just outside the door, silently waiting for the right moment to step in. His presence was quiet, but it was there, hanging in the air like a promise. Anna hadn't noticed him yet, her mind clearly too focused on the victory she thought she had won. But I wasn't worried. "Come on in," I said, my voice smoother than I felt. It was an invitation, but it didn't feel like one. She hesitated for a split second, surprised by my calm response. Then, as if the invitation was some kind of unspoken challenge, she stepped inside, her heels clicking louder now, echoing through the house. "You must really love this place," she said, her voice dripping with a kind of fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I can see why Mark wanted it so badly." I nodded, watching her every move with quiet interest. She was stepping into my life, my space, and yet there was a certain irony in how she walked through it like she was already entitled to everything I had worked for. Her words were meant to sting, but all they did was remind me of how far I had come, and how far she still had to go. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left Anna questioning everything she thought she knew, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. I watched as she walked further into the living room, her gaze finally settling on the furniture. The pictures on the walls, the familiar, comforting details that once made this house my sanctuary. But she didn't understand the significance of it all. She didn't know the years of memories that had been built here, the sacrifices I had made to keep this home, this family together. "Can we just get to the point?" I said, the words coming out with an edge that surprised even me. "What exactly are you here for, Anna?" She blinked, taken aback for a moment, but quickly recovered. Her smirk returned, the one I knew all too well, the one that told me she thought she was in control. "Mark told me I needed to come by today to help you get things sorted. With the move and everything." I could almost see the wheels turning in her head, calculating how much longer this would take. But there was something off in her demeanor. The confidence, the arrogance, it was all starting to crumble piece by piece. I could feel the shift in the air, the tension was palpable, and it wasn't just in me. "Right?" I said slowly, letting the silence hang between us. "Let's sort this out then." She glanced at my lawyer, finally noticing him standing by the door. The recognition flickered in her eyes, but she didn't speak, didn't ask who he was. Instead, she looked back at me, the smile still frozen in place, but now there was something else in her eyes. Doubt. Just a glimmer, but it was there. I took another breath, steadying myself. This was going to be interesting. The game had only just begun, and Anna hadn't realized yet that she was already on the losing side. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Couldn't be. When Mark and I first met, it felt like the world was at our feet. We were a team. I believed in him. I loved him with all my heart, and for the longest time I thought he felt the same. We built a life together, brick by brick, starting with nothing but dreams. We made plans, big ones, small ones. We talked about the future, about growing old together, about our shared hopes. There was so much trust between us. Or at least I thought there was. But somewhere along the way that trust started to crumble bit by bit. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't some dramatic shift that I could point to. No, it was a slow, steady erosion. The late nights at work. The whispers on the phone always just out of earshot. The secretive glances when he thought I wasn't paying attention. First, I made excuses. Work was stressful. He was just tired. It wasn't anything serious. But then I saw them together. It was supposed to be a girls' night out. A break from the tension that had been building between Mark and me. I needed space. Needed to remind myself what life used to be like before everything started to feel so heavy. I hadn't expected anything that night to change anything. Least of all my entire perspective on my marriage. But fate has a funny way of throwing things in your path when you least expect it. I walked into the restaurant, laughing with my friends, not thinking twice about the moment or what it could bring. But then there they were, in the corner booth, huddled close, laughing, their hands brushing against each other, like they were the only two people in the room, like nothing else mattered. He looked so different, so relaxed, so alive, a side of him I hadn't seen in years. And her. She looked up at him with those eyes, the kind of eyes you don't look at someone with when you've been married for 12 years. It was like a punch to the gut. I froze. My heart stopped, and for a moment, everything around me went quiet. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I should have walked over to them. I should have yelled. I should have confronted them right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and left, silently, feeling the weight of it all crashing down on me in waves. I went home that night, and instead of crying or screaming, I started planning. My heart broke, but my mind went into overdrive. I wasn't going to let him destroy me, not like this. Not when I had worked so hard to keep everything together. No, I was going to make sure that, when the time came, I was the one who held all the cards. And now, as Anna stood there in my living room, so smug, so certain of her place in my life, I felt that same cold clarity wash over me. The betrayal that had hurt so deeply was still there, still sharp and raw, but now it was something else. It was a weapon I would use to reclaim everything that was mine. She smiled again, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "I know this is hard for you, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But Mark and I are in love. It's time for you to move on." I could have felt anger. I could have lashed out, screamed at her for everything she had stolen from me. But instead, I just looked at her, calm, controlled, a smile playing at the corners of my lips. "You think this is your victory?" I asked, my voice steady. "You think you've won?" Her eyes flickered, just for a moment. She wasn't sure what I was getting at, and for the first time since she'd walked in, the smugness faltered. And I let the silence hang between us for a moment, watching her struggle to hold onto the confidence she had so clearly walked in with. Then, I spoke again, letting the truth settle in the air like a heavy weight. "Mark never told you the truth, did he, Anna?" I said softly. Her lips parted, but she didn't respond. Instead, she shifted uneasily from foot to foot, her hand tightening around the papers she still clutched. I didn't need to say another word. She was beginning to realize that the walls she had so confidently stepped into weren't as solid as she thought. This wasn't her victory. This was her downfall, and I was just getting started. I could see the change in Anna the moment the words left my mouth. She tried to hold her ground, but the confidence that had so easily flooded her when she first arrived began to crack. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in her posture, a quick glance toward the door as if she were searching for an escape. But I knew that the walls she had built so carefully around herself were starting to crumble. She shifted her weight, her eyes narrowing as she tried to regain control, but I could hear the edge in her voice now, the uncertainty creeping in. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her words trembling just slightly. "Mark told me everything. He said this house was his." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, knowing that every second of it would twist the knife a little deeper. She was floundering now, her breath coming faster, her grip on the papers tightening, as though they were the only thing keeping her grounded. But I could see it in her eyes. She was losing her grasp on the situation, and she knew it. "Mark told you, huh?" I repeated, my voice cold, almost amused. "Funny how people like him always seem to tell you what you want to hear, isn't it?" The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. I could almost hear her brain working overtime to piece it together. But it was already too late. She didn't have all the facts. She didn't know that the house she thought she was moving into wasn't Mark's to give away. She didn't know about the things I had kept hidden from everyone. Things I had built in secret while he was busy betraying me. I saw it on her face, the moment the realization started to dawn on her. Her brow furrowed in confusion, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. She was trying to make sense of it all, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand. And in that moment, I knew I had her. She was vulnerable now, exposed. "You didn't check the details, did you?" I asked, my voice dropping low, almost soothing, as if I were explaining something to a child. "Mark might have told you this house was his, but he lied." Anna's gaze flickered to my lawyer, who had been standing silently in the corner, patiently watching the entire exchange. It was almost like he was waiting for the right moment to step in, to deliver the final blow. And when she finally turned to him, I knew the game was over. "Is that true?" Anna asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't own it? My lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Anna. Miss Anna, he began, his voice smooth and professional. The house in question has never been in Mark's name. Not before, not now, and certainly not in any legal documentation related to their divorce proceedings. Anna blinked, the words not quite registering at first. She looked from the lawyer to me, her expression shifting from disbelief to growing panic. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as the truth started to sink in. No, that can't be right, she stammered, her voice shaking with frustration. Mark said he was taking care of everything. He promised me. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. Here she was, the woman who had so confidently waltzed into my life, believing that she was the one who would get everything she wanted. And now she was discovering, far too late, that she had been nothing more than a pawn in Mark's game. Mark lied, I said simply, the words cutting through the tension like a razor. He told you whatever you wanted to hear, but the truth is, this house was never his. It was never even part of the divorce settlement. Anna's face went pale. I could see the panic rising in her, the realization that everything she had built her hopes on was built on lies. The facade she had been holding up for so long was crumbling, and she had nowhere to turn. She took a step back, her hands trembling as she clutched the fraudulent papers to her chest, as if they were somehow going to save her from the truth. But I could see her crumbling, her walls falling apart. She was unraveling. You think you can just walk in here and take everything? I said, my voice firm now, the weight of my words sinking in. Do you really think Mark is the one in control? The silence in the room was deafening. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The lies had been exposed, and there was no denying the reality she had walked into. All of her carefully constructed plans were falling apart, and for the first time, she was seeing the truth for what it was. Anna was nothing but a pawn in this game. A pawn who had been used, manipulated, and discarded. And now, she was left to face the consequences of her blind trust. I let the silence stretch, knowing that every second of it was a reminder of the power I had regained. This was my life, my home, my future, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. Not Mark, not Anna, not anyone. And as I watched her, broken and lost, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for my house. I wasn't just fighting for my material possessions. I was fighting for the one thing I had nearly lost in all of this, the strength to stand up for myself, to reclaim my power, and to make sure that, no matter what, I would never let anyone steal my peace again. I watched as Anna's face drained of color, her eyes darting between my lawyer and me, searching for something, anything, that would make sense of the mess she'd found herself in. Her mind was clearly scrambling, trying to put the pieces together, but it was too late. The truth had already seeped in, and once it did, there was no going back. Her fingers tightened around the papers, the ones that she thought were her ticket to a new life. I could see her trying to hold on to them, as though they could shield her from the unraveling reality. But there was no protection left. The more she looked at those documents, the more I could see the cracks forming in her facade. She wasn't the confident, triumphant woman who had stood on my doorstep just moments ago. No, now she was a woman on the edge, unsure, vulnerable, and terrified of the consequences of her own misplaced faith. Mark told me this was all settled, she whispered, almost pleading now. He said it was done, that this house was ours. We were moving in. Her voice trembled, and I could hear the desperation beneath the bravado she had clung to. It was a far cry from the way she had entered my home, thinking she had everything under control. I let her words linger in the air for a moment, letting her see the enormity of the mistake she had made. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I just let her words hang there, like a weight in the room. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the realization finally breaking through her defensive walls. She had been lied to. She had been used. You really believed him? I asked softly, my voice smooth, almost too calm for the gravity of the situation. You believed every word he told you? She didn't answer, but I could see it now, the way her eyes flickered with doubt, with the kind of doubt that comes when someone is faced with the bitter sting of betrayal. It was the same look I had worn when I first realized Mark had been lying to me, when I had discovered that the person I had loved for so long was capable of such deceit. And now Anna was wearing it too. She was no longer the confident, assured woman who had come to claim what she thought was hers. No, she was just another victim of Mark's manipulation. He said I was overreacting, she murmured, almost to herself, that I should just trust him. He said it was all taken care of. Her voice was small now, and it was almost as though she were trying to convince herself that she hadn't been wrong, that Mark hadn't completely turned her life upside down. But the truth was already too clear. The house wasn't Mark's. It never had been. And in that moment, Anna had no choice but to face the ugly truth that she had been nothing more than another one of his lies. I could almost feel the pity in my chest, but I pushed it down. She had made her choices. She had chosen to ignore the signs, to trust in someone who didn't deserve it. And now, here she was, caught in the web of her own misguided trust. My lawyer, who had been silently observing all this time, finally spoke up. "Miss Anna," he said calmly, addressing her directly, "Mark tried to convince you of something that wasn't true. This house was never his to give. The paperwork he gave you, it's completely invalid." His words hit her like a slap to the face, and I saw her flinch, her eyes narrowing as she tried to process what he was saying. Her grip on the papers loosened slightly, but she didn't let go. She was still holding on to them like they were her lifeline, like if she just held them tight enough, everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. It was never going to be okay for her, not now. "You lied to me?" she muttered, looking at me with a mix of anger and confusion. "You set me up. You knew this was all a lie, and you just let me walk right into it." I wasn't surprised by her accusation. It wasn't new. It was the same thing people say when they realize they've been played, when they finally understand that they were never the one in control. I looked at her, my expression unreadable, and I gave a small shake of my head. "I didn't set you up, Anna," I said, my voice steady. "Mark did that, and you just happened to walk into his trap." She recoiled at my words, her face a mixture of rage and hurt, but I wasn't going to soften. She had walked into this, eyes wide open, thinking she had all the answers. Now she was left with nothing but the aftermath of her decisions. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice rising in frustration. "I didn't ask to be caught in your mess. You and Mark. Mark is no longer part of my life," I interrupted, my voice sharp now, cutting through her words like a blade. "And if you think for 1 second that you're going to walk in here, claim what isn't yours, and waltz away without consequences, you're mistaken." Her mouth snapped shut, and for a moment the room was silent again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Anna was standing there, facing the reality of her situation, and I could see the walls completely crumble around her. She had no power here. She had no control, and I wasn't going to let her take anything from me. Not my home, not my peace, and certainly not my dignity. Finally, she let go of the papers. Slowly, deliberately, she dropped them to the floor, the sound of the pages hitting the hardwood almost deafening in the silence. She didn't look at me as she bent to pick them up again. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time, I saw her not as a rival, but as someone who had fallen victim to the same kind of manipulation I had suffered from. And in that moment, I understood something. The pain I had felt, the anger, the betrayal, it had all been worth something. Because here, in this room, I wasn't just reclaiming my home. I was reclaiming myself. And Anna, well, she was finally learning the hard way what it meant to trust the wrong person. The silence hung heavy between us, thick with the weight of the truth that was now crashing down on Anna. She still hadn't fully absorbed it, still clinging to the hope that there might be some way to salvage what Mark had promised her. But I could see it in her eyes now, the flicker of doubt, the realization that she had been nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. She looked down at the papers once more, her fingers tracing the edges as if she were trying to force some kind of magic into them, some sort of validation. But the truth couldn't be undone. Not by any paper, not by any lie. The truth was already here, and it was only a matter of time before Anna fully grasped just how deeply Mark had betrayed her, just as he had betrayed me. My lawyer, who had been standing quietly, observing everything with a steady gaze, finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable finality to it, one that made it clear this conversation was nearing its end. "Miss Anna," he began, his tone professional, almost condescending in its politeness. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." The words, so simple, seemed to shake Anna's entire foundation. She raised her head, her eyes wild with confusion, desperation. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You're telling me this is all some kind of mistake?" I could see the disbelief clouding her expression. She wasn't ready to accept it. She still didn't want to believe that the man she had trusted had lied to her so completely, had used her to further his own selfish ambitions. "Yes," my lawyer said, unfazed by her outburst. "But unfortunately, the mistake was Mark's, and it's a costly one. You see, this house is not his to give away. It's never been his, and he never had the right to promise it to you." Anna's face twisted in confusion, her mind trying to process the enormity of the lie she had been sold. She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but the words didn't come. Her mouth closed again, and she looked at the lawyer, then at me, as though she were waiting for someone to offer her a lifeline. But I wasn't going to offer her any mercy. Not now. Not after everything she had been a part of. "You really didn't check, did you?" I asked, my voice soft, almost pitying, but with an edge that made it clear I was done holding back. "You just trusted him, believed everything he said, without asking a single question. How much of that was him charming you? Or maybe you didn't care about the details because you just wanted it all, his promise, his house, his future. You thought you could have it all, didn't you?" Her face flushed, and I could see the anger rising in her. She wasn't going to admit it. She wasn't going to admit that she had been too blinded by her own desires, by the allure of a life that seemed too good to be true. But she had been too naive. She had ignored all the signs, all the red flags that I had once ignored myself. And now here we were. "I trusted him," Anna said, the words barely a whisper, as if she were trying to convince herself that it wasn't her fault. "He told me he was going to fix everything. He said we were going to start fresh, together. He said we were going to make it work." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw something shift in her, vulnerability, regret, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of understanding that she had been played. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. "You should have known better," I said, my voice sharp now, cutting through the fragile walls she had built around herself. "You should have questioned him. You should have done your homework, asked the right questions. But instead, you walked right into his web, trusting him like he was some kind of savior. And look where that's gotten you." I watched her flinch at my words. I didn't regret them, not even a little. I had been where she was once, and I had made the same mistake, believing that love and trust were enough to protect me. But they hadn't been. And now she was facing the consequences of her choices. Anna didn't know what to say. She just stood there, staring at me, her mind clearly reeling from the magnitude of everything she had just learned. She was unraveling, and there was no way for her to put the pieces back together. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't finished showing her just how deep the lies went. "Do you want to know what really happened?" I asked, my tone now almost conversational, as though we were discussing a story we'd both heard 100 times before. "Mark didn't just lie to you about this house. He lied about everything. About us. About our marriage. About the future he promised me and then threw away for you." I could see the shift in her eyes, the confusion starting to give way to something else. Guilt. A realization. Maybe even shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. She was starting to understand, starting to see the full extent of the mess Mark had made. And now there was no denying it. She had been a part of it. "You're not the only one who's been hurt by him," I said, taking a step closer, my voice low and steady. "But unlike you, I'm not going to let him get away with it. Not anymore. And I'm not going to let you walk out of here thinking you're the one who's been wronged. Because you're not. You're just another victim. The silence between us was thick, the weight of my words settling into the room like a heavy fog. Anna was quiet now, not speaking, not fighting back. She had no defense left. No way to deny the truth anymore. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about Mark or Anna or the betrayal. This was about me reclaiming my life, my power, my voice. I had fought for this moment. I had fought for my peace. And in this battle of wits, there was only one winner. The room was thick with tension, the silence now settling in like a heavy weight on my chest. Anna's face was pale, her expression somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. I could see the pieces falling into place in her mind, marking the moment when she finally realized she wasn't just a victim of bad luck. She was a victim of Mark's lies. And the worst part? She was still holding on to them. I knew it was time to break the last bit of his hold over her, to expose the full extent of his deception. Mark didn't just lie to you about this house, Anna, I said, my voice steady now, as I let the full weight of the words hang in the air. He lied to you about everything. About us, about what you were really walking into. But the biggest lie of all? He thought he could play both of us and walk away unscathed. Anna's eyes flashed with confusion, her lips trembling, trying to make sense of it all. She wasn't ready to accept it. I could tell she still wanted to believe that Mark was the hero of her story, the one who would somehow save her from the mess she had found herself in. But the truth had already been laid out in front of her, and there was no more hiding from it. He told me we were going to have everything, she whispered, barely audible, her voice cracking as the reality of her situation began to settle in. That we were going to start fresh, that everything he'd lost he was going to get back, that we could have it all. I let her words hang in the air for a moment, watching the cracks deepen in her armor. Her desperation was palpable, but it wasn't just about the house. It was about the future she had been promised, the dream Mark had sold her. And now, the truth was splintering that dream into 1,000 pieces. He told me I was his future, she continued, her eyes flicking up to meet mine, a mix of guilt and anger flashing across her face. He said we'd start over, that everything he did, everything we were building, it would be ours. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, the audacity, the lies. But it was all a lie, I said, my voice firm now, cutting through her delusion. Mark didn't want a future with you, Anna. He wanted a future for himself. And you were just the next chapter in his story of manipulation. He used you to get what he wanted, and now look where you are. Standing in my living room, holding papers that mean nothing. Everything he promised you? It was built on lies. Her breath caught in her throat, her fingers trembling as they clenched around the papers. The same papers she had clung to for so long, the ones she thought would be her salvation. But now, they were just the remnants of a broken dream, a piece of paper that couldn't undo what had already been done. He said I was different, she muttered, almost to herself, as though trying to convince herself that she wasn't just another fool in his web. He said he wanted to build something with me, that he loved me. And maybe he did love you, I said softly, almost as if I were speaking to myself. But not in the way you think. Mark loves only one thing: control. And you were just another tool in his game. The truth hung between us, undeniable. I watched as Anna's grip on the papers loosened. She was starting to see it, starting to understand the enormity of her mistake. But there was still a part of her, deep down, that refused to let go of the dream. She wanted to believe that Mark hadn't lied to her completely, that somehow there had to be a way to salvage something, anything, from this wreckage. Why didn't you warn me? She asked, her voice thick with a mix of frustration and sadness. Why didn't you tell me what was really going on? I sighed, the weight of her question pressing down on me. I didn't need to, I replied, my voice steady but tinged with something colder. Because Mark had already made sure you wouldn't listen. He played both of us. And I let him. But not anymore. For the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't try to defend Mark or make excuses for him. She just stood there, silent, as the full impact of his betrayal hit her like a ton of bricks. "Mark never wanted to share anything with you," I said, my tone hardening. "Not the house, not the life you thought you were building together. He wanted to take from me, to strip me of everything, and then he tried to do the same to you." I could see the anger starting to build in her again, but it was different this time. It wasn't anger toward me. It was anger toward him, toward Mark, for deceiving her, for using her to further his own selfish agenda. And for the first time, Anna seemed to understand what I had been through, what we had both been through. She dropped the papers to the floor, the sound of them hitting the wood echoing in the silence. She didn't look at them again. She didn't look at me either. Instead, she just stood there, her shoulders shaking with the weight of everything she had just learned, everything she had just lost. I wasn't going to be her savior. I wasn't going to offer her forgiveness. Not today. Not after everything she had allowed herself to be a part of. But I wasn't going to gloat either. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about closure. "I'm done with him," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "I'm done." I nodded, watching her as she finally came to the realization I had already come to months ago. Mark's lies weren't just about the house or the life he promised. They were about control, about manipulation, about getting what he wanted at any cost. And in the end, it was only Anna and I who had lost. I turned away from her, walking toward the window and letting the cool breeze from outside wash over me. There was a strange kind of peace in the silence now, as if the weight of the lies had been lifted from my shoulders. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the end was closer than it had ever been. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally ready to move on. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Anna stood there, her face pale, her hands trembling as they clutched the discarded papers at her side. I could see her processing everything, watching her break down as the full weight of Mark's betrayal hit her with an overwhelming force. She had never truly understood until now. Not in the way I did. Not in the way I had lived through it. I watched her, waiting for the inevitable. She had to face this truth, just as I had. And when it hit her, I knew there would be no going back for her. No way to unsee the destruction Mark had caused in both our lives. The thing about realization is that once it takes root, it can never be pulled out. It grows, it festers, and there's no escaping it. I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, almost broken. "I don't understand how he could lie to me like this. Why would he do this?" The question hung in the air, a question that had been echoing in my mind for months. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, the confusion still clouding her thoughts. She wanted to believe Mark had some sort of justification, that there was a reason for all of this, some twisted logic that made sense of the chaos he'd created. But there was no justification. There was only selfishness, only manipulation. "I don't know why he did it, Anna," I said quietly, my voice calm, but with a sharp edge that spoke volumes. "But I know that he did it because he could, because you let him. You both let him. And now you're paying the price." Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and I could see the truth dawning on her, slowly but inevitably. She wasn't angry with me anymore. She wasn't angry with the lawyer or anyone else in the room. She was angry with herself. And for the first time, I saw a glimmer of self-awareness in her eyes. She had allowed herself to be swept up in a lie. She had believed in something that wasn't real. And now everything was falling apart around her. She shook her head slowly, almost in disbelief. "He promised me everything." "Everything?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "He said we would have it all, that we would build a life together, that he would fix everything." The pain in her voice was raw, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered, she had been part of this. She had been complicit in her own delusion. And though I could understand her heartbreak, I couldn't let myself forget the person who had caused this. Mark. I took a step forward, closer to her now, my tone firm. He promised you everything because he's a master at making people believe in his lies. He promised you what you wanted to hear. He made you feel special, like you were the one who would make it all work. But that's how he works. He uses people to get what he wants. And you were just another pawn in his game. The words landed with a finality that seemed to shatter whatever remaining illusions she had about him. I could see the flicker of realization in her eyes, that moment when she understood the extent of her involvement in Mark's manipulations. She wasn't innocent in this. She had been blinded by love, by his words, by the idea of a life that wasn't ever meant for her. She finally looked up at me, her face a mask of regret and shame. I thought he was different. I thought he was going to be the one who would change everything for me. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She had answered her own question. And now, there was nothing left to do but watch her face the consequences of her choices. I stood there, letting the silence stretch between us as she absorbed everything I had said. Her shoulders were slumped, defeated, the weight of her realizations finally breaking through. I didn't need to comfort her. I didn't need to show her any mercy. She had made her choice, and now it was time for her to live with it. I should have seen it, she muttered, her voice small, as if she were speaking to herself. I should have seen the signs, the late nights, the lies, the way he promised me things that never came true. I should have known. Her voice cracked, the shame in her words palpable. I wasn't going to sugarcoat it for her. This was a lesson she had to learn. The hard way. You don't get to blame anyone but yourself, I said quietly, but firmly. He didn't force you to trust him. He didn't force you to believe in his lies. You wanted to believe because it was easier. You wanted to believe that he was your ticket to something better. But now look at where you are. I paused, letting the words sink in. This isn't just about the house, Anna. This is about who you are and the choices you make. You've spent all this time chasing a dream that was never yours to begin with. And now it's gone. It's all gone. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she wiped at her eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. It was too late for that. The realization was all-consuming now, and it was her to carry, not mine. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though admitting it to herself made it all the more real. I know I was foolish. I was blinded by what he promised me. And now it's all falling apart. Everything. There was nothing left to say. The battle was over, and the truth had won. There was no more pretending, no more hoping for a different outcome. Anna had finally understood what I had known for so long, that Mark was never going to be the man he promised to be. He had never intended to be, and now he had left her with nothing. I took a deep breath, finally feeling the tension start to dissipate. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment of clarity. Now, I said, my voice steady, you have to decide what comes next. Are you going to let him destroy you? Or are you going to rebuild your life without him? She didn't answer right away, but the look in her eyes, so different from when she first arrived, told me everything I needed to know. The realization had sunk in. She knew what she had to do, and this time she was going to do it for herself. Anna stood there in the stillness, the reality of everything Mark had done settling on her like a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. Her shoulders slumped in defeat, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something stronger. Something that hadn't been there when she first stepped through the door. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. She was beginning to understand what needed to be done. But even as I saw her coming to terms with her own part in this, there was one final piece of the puzzle that had to fall into place. Mark. He had to be exposed for what he truly was. Not just the lies about the house or the promises of a future that never existed, but the real truth. The truth that I had been holding on to, waiting for the right moment. And now that moment had come. I picked up my phone, feeling the cool weight of it in my hand, knowing exactly what I was about to do. The call wasn't for me. It wasn't for Anna either. It was for Mark. The man who thought he could control everything. The man who thought he could walk away without consequences. I dialed his number, and as the phone rang, I could almost feel the air growing thick with anticipation. Anna looked at me, her eyes wide, but I didn't say anything. I just let the silence speak for itself. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about Mark, and I was going to make sure he knew just how wrong he had been. The phone clicked, and his voice came through, confident as ever. "Hey, babe," he said, like nothing had changed, like everything was still just the way he wanted it. I almost laughed, the sound bitter in my throat. "Mark," I said, my voice smooth, controlled. "Interesting day we're having, isn't it?" There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a confused chuckle. What's going on?" I let the question hang in the air for a moment, knowing that when I answered, there would be no turning back. "Oh, just the usual," I said casually, taking a sip of my coffee, enjoying the calm before the storm. "Except now, I'm standing in my house, watching Anna learn the hard way about what kind of man you really are." There was a long silence, the kind that stretched out uncomfortably. I could hear his breathing shift, uneasy, nervous. Mark wasn't used to being caught off guard. He wasn't used to someone else controlling the narrative. "What do you mean?" His voice was edged with panic now, the cracks in his usual bravado starting to show. "What's happening? What the hell did you say to her?" I could almost feel the smirk on my face as I leaned back in my chair, letting the truth weigh heavily on him. "I told her the truth, Mark," I said softly. "I told her everything, about how you lied. How you promised her a future that wasn't even yours to give. About how you tried to steal my house, my life, and tried to sell her the same broken dreams." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a string of curses. I could practically hear him scrambling, his mind racing to find an escape. But it was too late. He was already trapped. "You didn't think she'd figure it out, did you?" I continued, my voice almost mocking now. "You thought she was just another person you could manipulate into believing your lies, just like you did with me. But now she knows. She knows exactly who you are. And trust me, Mark, she's not the only one." A small, bitter laugh escaped me. I wasn't done yet. There was still so much more to unravel. "And by the way," I added, my tone colder now, "those papers you had her hold on to? The ones you thought were going to seal the deal? They're worthless. Just like you." I could hear him stammering on the other end, trying to piece together some kind of excuse, but there was nothing he could say to fix this. There was no saving face, no turning back the clock. His lies had caught up to him, and there was no more room to hide. "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice shaking. "I was going to fix it. I just needed more time. You don't know what this is doing to me." I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered everything he had done, all the pain he had caused, and the small shred of sympathy I had melted away. "No, Mark," I said, my voice dripping with finality. "You don't get to fix this. You don't get to fix everything you've broken. Not with me. Not with Anna. Not with anyone. You've already shown your true colors, and there's no going back from that." The line was quiet for a moment, and for the first time, I heard a trace of fear in his voice. "Please," he begged. Just help me. I can't lose this. I can't lose everything." But it was too late. I wasn't going to fix him. I wasn't going to save him from his own destruction. "Good luck, Mark," I said, my voice light, almost cheerful now. "But you're on your own." With that, I hung up. The finality of the action left a strange calm in its wake, as if I had finally severed the last connection that had bound me to him. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about me, taking back control, reclaiming my life and my future from the wreckage he had left behind. I turned to Anna, who had been standing silently throughout the call, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and something else. Relief, maybe. She wasn't the same woman who had walked in here just hours ago. She had seen the truth. She had seen Mark for who he really was. "Well," I said, breaking the silence, "that's the end of that." She nodded slowly, her face still a little pale but now more resolute. "I didn't expect that," she said softly. "I didn't expect you to take control like that." I shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of my lips. "Neither did I. But sometimes you just have to show them who's really in charge. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling around us. Mark had lost, and I had won because, in the end, the one thing I had taken from him was the thing he could never get back. The truth. Days passed, but the air in the house was still thick with the remnants of everything that had happened. Mark's lies were still fresh in my mind, but they no longer had the power to hurt me. I had reclaimed my peace, my strength, and with each passing day, it felt more like a distant memory. The battle had been fought, and the victor was clear. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it, and that's exactly what happened when Ashley came knocking at my door. I wasn't expecting her. I hadn't seen her since the confrontation at the house, and I honestly didn't think I'd ever see her again. But there she was, standing on my doorstep, looking smaller than I remembered. Her usually impeccable appearance was now disheveled, her makeup smudged, her hair out of place. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had once flaunted her place in Mark's life. Instead, she looked lost. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, observing her, letting the silence stretch out between us like a chasm. She shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable under my gaze. It was a stark contrast to the arrogance she had carried just a few days ago. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you," she said, her words laced with uncertainty. I made a mistake. There it was. The last thing I expected to hear from her. But there it was. She had come back, not with defiance or anger, but with something that felt entirely different: regret. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, watching her, carefully weighing her words. "I'm listening," I said, my voice neutral. She exhaled shakily and looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she finally looked up, I saw it in her eyes: shame. It was a look I recognized all too well, one I had worn myself just days before, when I had realized the extent of Mark's betrayal. She had been swept up in his lies, just as I had. "I was stupid," she began, her voice faltering. "I let him tell me everything. I thought I was different. I thought he was different. But he wasn't. I believed everything he said. I thought we could have a future, that I was going to be the one who made everything right for him." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and I could hear the sincerity in her words, the rawness of her realization. I didn't interrupt her. I just let her talk, because, in that moment, she needed to say it all. "I thought I was better than you," she admitted, her gaze finally meeting mine. "I thought I could take his place, that I could be the one he wanted. But I was wrong. I see that now, and I can't keep lying to myself." I let her words settle in the air for a moment. It wasn't an apology, not yet, not fully, but it was a start. A start I hadn't expected. Not from her, not after everything. But it was the truth. She was beginning to see it, just as I had. "I lost everything because I believed in him," Ashley continued, her voice breaking. "I gave up my friends, my family. I let him manipulate me. And now, I'm alone. I have nothing." I could see the weight of her words, the crushing realization that she had lost far more than she had ever expected. And while I could empathize, I couldn't offer her the comfort she was hoping for. She had made her choice. She had knowingly walked into the web Mark had spun. She had knowingly believed his lies, and now she was left to deal with the fallout. "You don't get to blame Mark for everything," I said, my tone firm, but not unkind. "You were part of this. You chose to believe his promises. You chose to ignore the truth when it was staring you in the face. I did the same thing, Ashley. I chose to believe in him too. But I woke up, and so should you." She nodded, the tears that had welled in her eyes finally spilling over. I know now. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For how I treated you. For believing him over you. I was wrong. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I had to say it. There it was. The apology I hadn't expected. But the one she needed to make. It was raw, real, and humbling. She had been a part of the destruction. But now, she was finally realizing it. She wasn't the confident woman who had barged into my life with a sense of entitlement. She was just a woman who had been used just like I had. And now she had to figure out what came next. I studied her for a moment longer, letting her words settle in my mind. She wasn't asking for my forgiveness. She wasn't asking for anything except to make it right in her own heart. And maybe that was all she could do now. Maybe that was enough. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice quieter now, more measured. "But I do understand. And I think that's the first step for both of us. You need to forgive yourself for the choices you made. And then you need to move forward. You need to build a life that's yours. Not based on lies. Not based on someone else's broken promises." Ashley swallowed hard, nodding as she wiped her eyes. For the first time, I saw something in her that wasn't arrogance or deflection. There was acceptance in her face, a willingness to face what she had done and what she had lost. She straightened up, taking a deep breath. "I'm going to try," she said quietly. "I'm going to try to rebuild. I don't know where to start, but I'm going to try." I gave her a small nod, the first real sign of understanding passing between us. "That's all you can do," I said. "Good luck, Ashley. And remember, this is your life now. Take control of it. Don't let anyone else dictate your worth." She gave me a small, sad smile before turning to leave, her footsteps soft as she made her way down the driveway. I watched her go, wondering what would become of her. Would she find peace? Would she rebuild herself? Or would she remain tethered to the wreckage of her past? Either way, it didn't matter to me anymore. I had moved on. I had closed that chapter in my life for good. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in the revenge I had imagined. It was in the freedom I had gained. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of peace that I hadn't felt in what felt like years. The constant hum of anxiety that had once echoed in every corner of my life had finally faded, leaving space for something new to take root. It was as if the weight of everything, Mark, the lies, the betrayal, had been lifted, and in its place, I could finally breathe. I spent those days reflecting, not on the pain or the hurt, but on the strength it had taken to get to this point. The truth had a way of changing things, of reshaping everything it touched. And for the first time in so long, I felt like I had control again. Not just over my home, but over my life, over my future. I was no longer tethered to a past filled with lies and manipulation. I had learned how to protect myself, how to stand tall in the face of uncertainty. And that was a power no one could take from me. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no fiery sense of triumph. Just a quiet, peaceful realization that I had won. It wasn't because I had taken anything from anyone. It wasn't because I had gotten revenge or seen someone else suffer. It was because I had moved on, because I had let go of the bitterness, the anger, and the hurt that had once consumed me. I no longer needed to dwell on Mark or Ashley or the twisted web they had tried to trap me in. I had built something of my own now, something that was mine and mine alone. And it felt good, felt right. The business I had started from scratch was beginning to flourish. The boutique, which Mark had once scoffed at, had become more than just a store. It had become a symbol of everything I had fought for, everything I had reclaimed. It wasn't just a place of work. It was a place of strength, a place where I could breathe, where I could create and build the future I had always dreamed of. I found myself waking up every day with a sense of calm that I hadn't known in years. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow over the shop as I prepared for the day. The sounds of customers browsing, of conversations, of life moving forward, were a symphony that filled the space with joy, not the stress and tension that had once defined my existence. And yet, even as I moved forward, I couldn't help but look back, if only for a moment. Not with regret or anger, but with a sense of closure. Mark had thought he could break me. He had thought that I would crumble under the weight of his lies. But what he didn't realize was that it was his lies that broke him, not me. His manipulation had trapped him, had left him with nothing. And me? I had found freedom. I had made my peace with everything. With the hurt, with the betrayal, with the broken dreams. I had accepted it, and in doing so I had let go. The power was mine now. I had risen from the ashes of everything he had tried to destroy, and I had built something better. Something real. One evening, as I sat in my boutique, watching the last of the customers leave for the day, I realized how far I had come. The quiet hum of the shop, the gentle clinking of glass as I tidied up, it was all a reminder of the life I had created. A life I had chosen, free from the shadows of my past. And then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly who it was. Mark. I stared at the message for a moment, feeling a strange sense of detachment wash over me. Sarah, I messed up. I know you probably hate me, but I need help. I lost my job and I have nowhere to go. Can we just talk, please? For a moment, I thought about it. I thought about the anger that once burned inside me when I heard his voice, when I saw his face. But now I felt nothing. Not anger, not pain, not even regret. It was as though he had never mattered at all. I deleted the message. It was the only response that made sense. I didn't need to fix him. I didn't need to go back to a past that had no place in my present or my future. The phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. I didn't need to listen to his pleas. I didn't need to hear his voice. The chapter was closed. And for the first time, I felt completely at peace with that. A week later, as I walked through the boutique, a familiar face appeared at the door. It was Ashley. She hesitated, looking unsure, as if she wasn't sure whether she belonged here anymore. I watched her for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, before I approached her. She looked different, smaller, less sure of herself, but not in the same way she had been before. She had learned something. Maybe it wasn't enough, but it was a start. I got a job, she said, her voice uncertain. But there was a softness in her tone now. It's in marketing. It's not much, but it's something. I nodded, my gaze steady. Good for you, I said, offering a small smile. You'll find your way. She smiled back, though it was tinged with sadness. Honestly, I don't know how you put up with him for so long, she said, shaking her head, as if she were finally seeing things clearly for the first time. I smirked, just a little. Neither do I. There was a long pause, a moment where neither of us spoke. And then she spoke again, her voice tentative. Do you think we could be friends? I considered her question, thought about the journey we had both been on, the things we had lost and the things we had gained. Not friends, I said slowly, but maybe one day. She nodded, a hint of relief in her eyes, as if that answer was enough for her. She bought a scarf and left the store, her footsteps lighter than when she had entered. It was as if, in that small moment, she too had found a little peace. As I watched her walk away, I knew that the final chapter of my life with Mark had closed. There would be no more looking back, no more holding on to the past. My life was moving forward, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The business grew, my friendships deepened, and for the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't waiting for the next betrayal or the next heartbreak. I was simply living, finally free to be who I was meant to be. And as the sun set, casting its golden light over the boutique, I raised a glass of wine to the future, to the strength I had found, to the freedom I had claimed, and to the peaceful victory that was mine.